Okay, then, I think we are live. We are live from Massachusetts to California. This is Jane Ganal. I am the co-founder of Litquake. This is our 22nd year, and we are thrilled to be here tonight for a discussion about an amazing, amazing book, doubly amazing to me for reasons I'll explain. Before we begin, I want to tell you that Litquake goes through October 23rd. Which is the night of the Lit Crawl, which I'm sure most of you listening know about, where we take over the Mission District for a barrage of fantastic readings that are live and in person, because this is San Francisco, damn it. Anyway, so please tune in, check our website at litquake.org for the schedule, and we hope to see you out at one of our in-person events. Tonight, however, we are virtual. This is event I've been looking forward to for a long time, in conversation with Julia Cooke in regards to her book, Come Fly the World, the Jet Age Story of the Women of Pan Am. I realize these Zoom formats don't really work too well for this. And I am excited, especially because I come from a Pan Am family, as does Julia. My father was a Pan Am pilot. My mother was a Pan Am stewardess. They both flew pretty soon after the World War II, but we'll get into that more shortly. Julia Cooke's journalism has been published in Time, Smithsonian, and Condé Nast Traveler. She is the author of The Other Side of Paradise: Life in New Cuba, and the daughter, as I said, of a former Pan Am executive. She normally lives in Vermont, but she's talking to us from Massachusetts tonight. And just to set the stage for her book, Come Fly the World basically remembers a time when air travel was synonymous with luxury and glamour, not like today, and not just for passengers, but also for the women who were hired to wait on these passengers. To quote People magazine, in the 60s and 70s, Pan Am stewardesses changed a sexualized job requiring weigh-ins and retirement at 26 into a forum for serious work. They became ambassadors, transported traumatized soldiers, rescued Vietnamese children in Operation Baby Lift. This is a fascinating history of a bygone era. So welcome, Julia Cooke.
Thank you so much for having me, Jane.
And I should say that anytime you viewers would like to ask a question, you can put it in the chat section. I think I will wait until close to the end of the hour to address those questions. But for now, she and I are just going to converse a bit. I just can't even express how fantastic I thought this book was. And I had to keep asking myself, is it because your parents were there? But I just think it was beautifully written, and it read like a novel, actually. The women's lives were so beautifully depicted, and you focus on four women who flew during those critical decades. And I wonder if you can just kind of give a brief description of each of them and say why you chose to focus on them.
Yeah, so the three primary characters or subjects of the book I came across them almost accidentally. At first, I just, in my research, I realized that I wanted to write about former Pan Am stewardesses, and I didn't know what angle I wanted to take, how I wanted to structure my inquiry. And I wound up I was just talking to people who had interesting stories. And the thing about these women is that for reasons that become apparent in the book, they really hadn't been taken very seriously by someone who was interested in hearing not about celebrities that they transported and met, or the more salacious details of their lives, but I was really interested in the history and in the soft politics, soft power angle of what they were doing, soft diplomacy. So each of these women that I would talk to would send me to two or three others. And they would say, oh, you have to talk to this person. She, translated for this ambassador on a state visit to this country, or she did this. And pretty soon I talked to Tori Werner, who was one of the main subjects of the book. Tori is from Norway. She was incredibly ambitious. She really wanted to be an ambassador herself, a diplomat in Norway, but she learned right as she was about to graduate, well, a little before graduation, she found out that women had to have PhDs. Men would be hired right out of college, but women had to have PhDs. And she needed a job that would pay her right out of school. So she decided to just try flying for a couple of years, and then after which she would settle down at a serious job. And 5 decades later, her serious job was with Pan Am. She then sent me to Karen, who was also on the Operation Baby Lift flight with her. Karen is from California. She's very Californian to me. Of course, I'm not from California, but she's very athletic and optimistic, and really a little bit dry. She has an incredible sense of humor. She's got a bit of a romance to her. She's very interested in seeing the world from a perspective of self-actualization. She then, I found out through other people, that's how I met Lynn, who was also on the Baby Lift flight. Lynn is from upstate New York. She was always very serious. She was a science major in school, but she really, she was kind of intimidated by the men in the labs. And she also is much more of an extrovert than, straight up lab work would have really allowed her to do. She also felt very constrained by the gender norms of the era. And she didn't want to be a science teacher, which is what she felt like she would wind up doing, either being an assistant in a lab or a science teacher in a school. And she just did not love either of those options. So she also kind of, as like a little, let's just give it a shot, decided to fly. And of course, all of them, these women flew for many, many more years than they thought they would. And then the other 2 women that I talked to a lot are Hazel and Claire, who were not on the Operation Baby Lift flight. But Hazel was one of the first, she was in the first wave of African-American women to be hired by the airlines, and Pan Am in particular. And she's a remarkable woman. She's so daring and really interesting. Like she's incredibly optimistic also, and incredibly upbeat and smart. And she found something to love in basically every single place that she went to. She never saw a place that she didn't want to go to again, never saw a thing that she didn't want to try. She was up for anything. And then Claire was one of the first women on Pan Am to be promoted from stewardess into management. She was incredibly ambitious, really, really wanted to pursue that path, and she did.
So I love your sort of summation of the kind of woman that would want to do this job. You said anyone could get married, but not everyone could smuggle a newsreel from the war in Pakistan to Hong Kong for a journalist, or keep a cabin cool while coming under unexpected fire on a flight to Da Nang. And I'm like, yeah, I just, who would actually want that job? Well, these women were very unusual for the time. They were adventurous. They wanted to travel. They wanted to see the world. I'm intrigued by, having read the histories of these women, how, and this is a whole separate conversation, but like my mother, for example, was from a very low income Central Florida family. She had 5 siblings. How come she was the one that said, I'm going to learn languages, I'm going to go to college, I'm going to see the world, and these other women didn't come from backgrounds that you would immediately think, oh, they're going to be adventurous, they're going to travel the world and really see some exciting history in the works. Anyway, it must be a genetic thing. That's all I can think of, that makes some women want to bust out of the confines of what they were given when they were born.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think so I have a 9-month-old daughter. I have 2 boys and a girl, and uh, so twin 9 months old, no, my 9 month olds, and a 2 and a little bit year old. And my boys are very chill, and my girl, when she sees a new area, she crawls around and she sees a new space, and she literally yelps with joy. And she the exploration, it's incredible how it does feel in I would never have, until watching her, I would never have agreed that these things are just, traits that we're born with. But I think I'm changing my mind.
Well, and definitely all the, kids in my immediate generation, we all feel somehow gypped, or, we're so restless, we just have to, even if it's just a road
Yeah.
trip someplace, got to go, go, go.
Yeah.
Um, so, much has been written about the horrible, well, I don't want to call it sexism because it kind of was what was happening at the time, but in terms of stewardesses needing to weigh in, and the kind of brutal interview process, where they, here's one, but one person said dumpy, head small for body, theatrical, too much eyebrow. These were written on applicants' files. And yet they expected these women to know languages. They had to just even to be hired, and be cool under conflict, like, as as I quoted a minute ago, flights were routinely fired on landing in Vietnam, toward the end of that war. And oh my gosh, there was a harrowing example in the book about having to stay, talk about grace under pressure when the plane is boarded by militants that are kidnapping somebody.
Yeah.
So I think what they wanted from these women was astonishingly, almost impossible for anybody to want to accomplish, and yet they did.
Yeah, so even just in the interview process, it really it was such a dichotomy between they
Mhm.
really wanted this woman who was, as a human being, male or female, very, well prepared, um, curious, engaged, interested in people, invested in customer service, able to really field, to be very cool under pressure. And they would have conversations in the interviews that kind of got at that ability to stay cool, and to think critically in the moment, and then they were also incredibly sexist. The details of what these people would note down, exactly as you read, it's excruciating to read as a woman, and just think about that level of assessment being the norm.
Mhm.
So yeah, it was one of the first things that really engaged me about writing about this subject, was exactly what you're saying, that it seemed like an impossible ask, and yet so many women answered the call. And it was, the statistics, the numbers are unbelievable, that airlines hired 3 to 5% of applicants in 1960. So droves of women wanted this job.
Especially
Um,
since you say they did not often stay in the job for very long because they'd get married, or who knows what, maybe the stress of it, because they worked them really hard, it sounds like.
they worked them incredibly hard. And the constraints were, again, super sexist. You had to quit if you got married or had kids, in part because they really leaned on that being a practical thing. And they most ridiculous, paternalistic comments about how, a woman's safety and the baby's safety, of course, were part of that whole argument. But really, it came down to, they wanted the women to be able to still be these kind of anodyne sex objects, and be seen as available. And wearing a wedding band, or certainly being pregnant, took away that sheen of availability. So no, but what I find really really interesting. Oh, crap, I was going to say something, and I lost it.
I'm
The
glad it's
sheen of
not free.
availability, I lost it. Sorry.
That was such an enchanting phrase. It sort of took your head out of it. Um, I was just looking at a quote that I love from one of the stewardesses that said, "I think of myself as someone who knows how to open the door of a 747 in the dark, upside down, and in the water."
And that reminds me that exactly this is what I was going to say, that I think so in the 1960s, at the start of the decade, these women were subjected to incredibly sexist requirements, both at hiring and then in terms of they were able to be fired for these offenses like getting married or having kids. And over the course of the 60s and in the early 70s, they really shifted the job in incredible ways. They advocated for themselves. They went to
Mhm.
court to be able to keep the job because they wanted to keep this job. It was supposed to be like a short-term stint, and management wanted them to quit before they got married, before they had lots of, health insurance demands or more complicated lives and dependents. And the women didn't want to do that. They wanted to stay. They wanted to keep working, and they really they made huge. They set legal precedent in the lawsuits that they propelled forward. What was interesting to me was why did they love the job so much? There have been books written about the way that these women propelled the feminist movement through the courts. And what was interesting to me was, but what were they experiencing that made them want to keep the job? It was incredibly physically demanding. They were subjected to really sexist workplace attitudes, and still, these were clearly feminist thinking, forward thinking, ambitious women. What were they experiencing that made them want to stay? So that's really what pushed me into writing this book. And I think I came away with a much deeper understanding of what and why.
Yeah, I mean, it was a revelation for me to learn. I mean, we always heard the family lore was that, my mother went to college, learned languages, signed up with Pan Am, and then left, I don't know, was it like 3 or 4 years, not very many years later, to get married to my dad, who was a pilot. Um, and she never seemed to express any dismay about that, which I thought, even as a kid, I'm like, well, that's crazy. Why? In any case. Um, but it was a revelation, I started to say, to know that the stewardesses fought to change that in this landmark labor law case, which I was never aware of. That was quite interesting to me.
Yeah.
Um, why do you think that now is a good time to tell the story of these women?
Oof. I think there are a lot of things. I think first of all, women of my generation. I'm 38 now. I grew up feeling pretty free as far as the ability to travel and move around and do my own thing. And I think that these women represent kind of a missing link as far as really understanding how we went from the 1940s and 50s, where there was this expectation that that traveling made women compromised our goodness in a way, that women had to travel with a chaperone or a husband. You couldn't solo travel for women was not a thing. My ability to move around the world with alone with the kind of freedom that I feel, it's a hard won right. And I don't think that these women were a huge part of earning that right. They were the first wave of women in the world by themselves, traveling without men, by themselves or in groups of women, unaccompanied. They were justified in their travel. They were getting company per diems to fund their exploration. So they walked around the world with a dignified ownership that I think is really important to recognize. And I don't think that just claiming that freedom without giving credit where credit's due is really right. I also think that they unite to two poles that are not often seen as really coming together. They're the very stereotypically feminine and the very staunchly feminist. And I think that they represent a level of complexity in that way that I think is really important to examine and understand better.
That's really, really well said. I was thinking you referenced in the book the fact that the era that you're talking about was really in the middle of a culture war in some respects, and so I sort of feel like that's where our country is right now too. I mean, not so much completely in regards to women, although there have been some huge changes in that respect lately, um, but yeah, you said, I thought it was interesting that you noted that this was not like a mantle that they intended to carry, the feminist mantle, so to speak. You write, stewardesses, young, beautiful single women in great numbers with access to movement around various geographies, were often unintentionally in the thick of the culture wars. And this is also after the birth control pill had become a thing. So I guess it's only natural that they would become, fetishized as the wild women that, I'm sure some of them were, but I'm guessing at least the characters that you wrote about, the characters, like
I
they're
know.
fictional, the people, the women, were just like you and me. They were
Yeah.
in the sense that they were not hedonists or whatever, off looking for the next
No,
flame.
they were regular women who, and I think that it is important to note that, sexual freedom is important, and that sexual empowerment was a part of what was enabling their movement, and what some women were excited about. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that books like Coffee, Tea, or Me
Right.
are certainly the reality of like 2% of the women who worked there. The issue is that it was seen as being 90% of the women. I'm referencing the 1967 book that
Yeah,
was all
I want
about.
to talk a little more about that. Yeah, I think the young audience members may not have heard of that, but it was called Coffee, Tea, or Me, and it was supposedly a memoir, right, by stewardesses about their
Yeah.
lives, when in fact it was by
A man, a PR guy, who I interviewed, and he was so unbelievably dismissive of these women. That he
really.
interviewed. Oh, it was one of the things that made me certain that I had to write this book, because he described one of the two women that he met as a big blousy blonde. And
Who uses that word anymore?
I know it was it was it was unbelievable. It was entirely believable that a older PR guy from the 60s in Manhattan would be so casually sexist while talking to me like 8 years ago. I guess it is startlingly believable, but I found it incredibly. It really burned me. That this man would take these women's experiences and then write this fake book, and then he hired them to go on the road and tour as the authors of the book. So the ruse was it was 360 degrees. It was very complete. And the women were up for it because they were they felt like their story was getting out there. And again, like the book really focused on or pitched all stewardesses as really seeking one of two things, which was either sex or shopping. And again, plenty of the women that I talked to really loved shopping in different places, but some of them really enjoyed sexual freedom, and that's great. And I don't think there's anything wrong with either of those things, but it is so far from the lived reality of the vast majority of the women that I talked to, who were women who were working a job that they found really empowering, because they got to travel to these different places that they found incredibly interesting. They got to experience other cultures and other people, and they got to experience themselves in these different places and see how travel made them different. And they got to take home paychecks that were pretty significant, and they got to send their parents on amazing trips. And they, like, the list goes on and on. The job was not about sex and shopping for them. So yeah.
In terms of the coffee, tea, or me phenomenon, I'm thinking in some respects it was probably inevitable because, again, stewardesses were both beautiful and, independent and feminine and feminist. You even say, mainstream American society didn't know what to do with women like this, and so, but I was kind of mortified to read how extreme it all became, in terms of the way women were treated, started being treated at a certain point. And I think where Pan Am would always take the high road, other airlines, was it Braniff that you said, they started out with kind of A-line type coats, and then by the end of the trip, they're like peeling layers to where they're wearing like leopard print jumpsuits.
It was called the Airstrip, and you can actually go on YouTube and watch a video of their commercials. Let me tell you about the rabbit hole that is watching old airline videos on YouTube. It's amazing, but appalling, but also such a slice of time. But yeah, they actually had their women, their stewardesses wearing like 4 different layers of clothes, and in between each meal course, they would take off another layer, and they called it the Airstrip.
Wow. And I think it was Continental that had an ad that said something like, our movies are so, gripping that you might forget to look at the other natural wonders on our flight. And there was a picture of a stewardess's butt.
Yep.
Oh, dear God.
And then there's the National Airlines Fly Me campaign, where these women were, they had to wear pins that said "Fly Me." And it just, a bunch of them just talked back and took it to the courts and tried to get an injunction against the airline, the ad campaign, and they were not successful in that regard. But all of these different moments in which women were saying, "No thanks, that's not us.
Enough already."
Yeah, it's remarkable.
I'm trying to think of which of your women subjects finally said that's enough when a man snapped.
Oh, that's Karen. It's so Karen. She was starting to get tired of the job itself, just in terms of the physical demands of it. And she had always wanted to be a writer. And she was successful at it. She got a column in her local newspaper, and she was thrilled about it. And so she was doing both of these things. She had successfully used flying to propel her to her next phase of her career. And she was on a plane, and a passenger snapped his fingers at her, and she turned around and she said, "Nope." And she went right to the office and quit that day.
Wow. And yet her contribution just can't be, overstated. We'll get to some questions shortly, but I think many people have sort of forgotten the Operation Baby Lift episode of our history. I mean, I hadn't forgotten it, but I had to be reminded by reading about it. And oh my goodness, what a crazy and ultimately controversial, situation, and something that Pan Am was deeply, deeply involved in.
Being in San Francisco, and I'm so curious if any of you in the audience want to chime in the Q&A section, or the chat section, or the Q&A section. does it feel like that's a part of San Francisco's like cultural lore? It was so much, my research really made me think that the city really came together to try to figure it out, because it was such a complicated event that really seemed really wonderful and important, and was turned out to be so much more complicated and appalling, and it really it from my research, it seemed like the city was very consumed by it for quite some time. And I'm curious if it feels like it lives in the texture of important things that happened.
You know, I think what year was that again? 60?
75.
Oh, was it that late?
Yeah. So someone's asking in the chat, what was the Operation Baby Lift was an episode in April of 1975, at the very end of the Vietnam War, as the city was being taken over by the North Vietnamese, and Saigon was being evacuated. It's far more complex than I'm going to be able to say right now, but about 2,000 Vietnamese children, refugees, were brought to the US on civilian airlines. It later turned out that not all of them were orphans. It was incredibly disorganized. A number of the children had living parents and had been left at the orphanages or in the care of people in Saigon, with the understanding that the parents, whose hometowns and places that they were living were in the upheaval of war, that the parents were going to come back and get their children, and then the children were sent on these planes and adopted by American families. And it was a real mess for quite some time. So that was Operation Baby Lift.
And it became controversial for that reason, though, because it turns out some of these children were actually not orphans. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the due diligence had not been done. It was incredibly, there was a level of arrogance and the cultural assumption that all children would be better off in America than in Saigon, and it was really a difficult and appalling moment. Even if in moments and in certain times, everyone involved in it had been very well intentioned. For the women who crewed the flight, the first flight of Operation Baby Lift, who my three primary subjects were on that flight. They were their intentions and their actions were incredibly pure and really laudable. They had been told that they would be going into Saigon to fly out 370, I think, children some of whom had been in an airplane crash the day before. And they did not know whether Saigon was going to be the site of, they were going to get bombed or shot at, or whether the North Vietnamese were going to try to subvert their flight in some way. They were really put in an incredibly dangerous position, and they were told that they were taking children who were refugees and needed help. And again, the majority of the children on these flights were that, but not all. So
there was a very poignant section in your book that I did not know about. Maybe my sister did, who's actually on the chat tonight, about how Pan Am contracted with the government to fly GIs from Vietnam to some R&R time, and how the stewardesses found themselves in this position of really therapist to some of these badly PTSD war veterans. Probably not something they taught, even with as thorough as a training as they did get.
Definitely not. And then, those flights were so meaningful to every woman that I talked to. I heard from women who, and again, in my subjects in the book, their opinions on the war really varied. Tori was somewhat hawkish in that she came from Norway, and she really felt very keenly that the sense of duty towards not NATO, yeah, NATO, for keeping Norway safe and keeping the USSR from trying to take over. And she felt like that she saw echoes of that in the Vietnam War, and so she was very proud to be flying soldiers to help defend a small seaside nation from communism. She felt very, very proud. And then there was Lynn, who had been actually involved in the anti-war movement. She really saw nothing to be proud of in the war itself, but she felt very strongly that that the men who she was flying, that their experiences were so varied, and that their what they were doing on that plane really that they deserved and really demanded all of the compassion and empathy and kindness and respect that she could possibly offer them, because keep in mind the draft was happening then, and she didn't know who wanted to be where, so she could disagree with the war all she wanted to, but she was not going to do anything but be therapist, cheerleader to these men who were in a horrible position.
Just to interject a very quick personal story, and the lights actually went out in this conference room. I keep trying to like make them. It's a what do you call it? A motion detecting thing.
You could get up and do a dance.
I will probably have to in a minute, because as the sun goes down, you won't be able to see me. But my father was. I guess I think he offloaded passengers on his 747 as Saigon was falling around the time of the baby lift, and offloaded the passengers and talked to the crew and told them, that it was optional for them to go with him to Saigon to try to take out Americans who were in grave danger. Mm-hmm. And, to a person, every single stewardess said, we're let's go, which I thought was amazing.
It gives me chills. Like it
I know. And he flew as they were approaching the airport. They got the word that it had fallen to the North Vietnamese. So anyway, but it was already a great story, and it didn't have a terrible ending, which it easily could have. Mm-hmm.
And I think I saw in the chat that someone mentioned that there are echoes of the Afghanistan evacuations. So. I completely agree. I was watching the news, and I actually noticed that there was one article. The Washington Post published an article about the flight crews who were crewing all of these different flights out of Afghanistan, and I was really pleased to see that someone was actually giving credit where credit is very much due.
Does anybody have an actual question for Julia? I'm happy to. Well, she's looking at the chat too, or you could put it in the Q&A section down here, but I don't see any.
And I'll also add that I have, in some of these events that I've done, there have been former flight crew. So if any of you are former flight crew in the audience, just pop where you flew out of and what years into the chat. I'd love to see that.
Most definitely. I was really, here's one in the Q&A, hold on. Did you pour through old newspapers as part of your research?
I did. So my research, like I mentioned, I really wanted to write about the experiences of these specific women because I felt like that was the story that was really missing. There have been a lot of good academic books about either the jet age, or there's an incredible book about how the American airline industry is so intertwined with the era of American ascendance abroad in the 50s and 60s. There have been really great books about feminism, the feminist movement, and stewardesses. So there are a lot of academic books about the broader cultural currents, but nothing that really prioritized the experiences of the women who were doing these things. So that's what my goal was. So my strategy was for research, I would interview people, talk to the women and women around them, lots of different, many dozens of interviews. And then I would, for my primary subjects, I would interview them about something that I wanted to know. So like say, take that, you mentioned the diplomatic kidnapping incident in West Africa. So I talked to Tori about that. She told me that this had happened, and I was floored. I could not believe that had happened. I thought to myself, you have to be making this up. Like this could not have happened the way that you are saying that it happened. So I then went to the old newspapers, exactly, the New York Times archives. And I saw that in fact it had happened. There were 3 or 4 articles about it. And so I called Tori again and I said, okay, second interview. Here's what you told me. Here's what I just read about. What else? I asked her a whole barrage of other questions spurred on by the newspapers. She told me more. And then I went to the academic books about like the history of world events. And then I looked for declassified government documents, and I found a couple of memos from diplomatic cables from that region that were referencing the same event. And then I talked to other women who had been on the same flight. So it really was cobbling together oral history and then secondary sources like old newspapers, a ton of them, and then primary sources like government memos or cables or letters. Old letters were great.
There's another question about how many women you interviewed before you settled on your main ones, and how and when did you know that they were the ones?
Yeah, I had probably interviewed 3 dozen women before I settled on them, and actually possibly more. I didn't meet Hazel until pretty late in the game, and I had met Claire and interviewed her first, but then decided to make her one of the central subjects a little later in the game. So yeah, it all came together when I met Lynn. I met Lynn last of the 3 primary subjects, and it felt like it was all that felt like I had found something.
What's it like today for somebody who wants to become a flight attendant? How competitive is it compared to back then? And, dovetailing, when did it go from being stewardess to flight attendant, and why? I mean,
So
I
in
think I know the answer. They felt
yeah,
like stewardess was pejorative, right?
it was pejorative, but also it was no longer applicable after 1972 when a man named Celio Diaz brought a lawsuit against Pan Am, in fact, because Pan Am wanted to continue hiring only women. And he claimed that he was being discriminated against because he couldn't get a job as a steward. And he won his lawsuit, as well he should have. The defense, I mean, if you really want to walk away feeling very angry, but also happy that that era is gone, you can read the law briefs about that lawsuit, because the defense that Pan Am put on, trying to explain why only women should be able to crew on their planes, is amazing. Horrible, amazing. But so after that, men started being hired in higher numbers on all the different airlines, and everyone agreed, both men and women in flight service, that a new term was due. What I found interesting is that the women that I was interviewing, who a number of the women really preferred the term stewardess because they felt like it pinned them to the era that they worked in, and that the term stewardess, which is why I use it, I'm not trying to be dismissive of or suggest that anyone should be using the term stewardess to refer to a female flight attendant in this day and age. They are flight attendants. But the stewardesses that I interviewed really preferred the term because they felt like it denoted the job that they had performed, the constraints, and the benefits as well. As far as it being competitive today, I don't know. I could not speak to the actual, like, whether how hard it is to get a job in flight service nowadays. But I will say that my best friend from Cuba, who now lives in Chicago, but he left Havana a couple of years after I did my research and wrote my book about Cuba. He is now a flight attendant, and he loves it. He has I think that it is still. Through him, I've met a couple people who work in flight service, and it's still such a job for people who can't sit still and who really want something flexible and interesting, and that's going to keep them on their toes, and who like changing landscapes and don't really want to stay in one place.
There was a question on how long you worked on the book, from conception to research to writing. It sounds like it was quite a long time.
Yeah. 6 or 7 years. The first couple of years I had a really hard time with momentum. Karen can attest to the fact that I would call her to do an interview and I would get really excited, and then like 10 months would pass and I would just disappear. And then I'd come back and be like, so I'm still working on this. But the problem was I was living in New York and teaching at the New School and also doing journalism, and there was just no momentum. It's really hard to write a book-length project. I found it really hard to write a book-length project while living in New York. And then my husband and I moved to Vermont, to a small town, and I was able to quit teaching, even though I really enjoyed teaching, but I just couldn't be.
Can't do it all.
Yeah, so I was able to quit teaching and just focus on journalism and the book. It was really, really wonderful.
Darlene asks if you recorded your interviews.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if maybe you would, if she's interested in hearing those or whatever, but Terry says she listened to the audiobook. Are there photos in the paper version? Oh, yes. Some beautiful photos in here. Many.
They're actually also on both my website, juliacooke.com, and the comeflytheworld.com website. So you can look through them and see what everyone looks like, which I think is really
That's
fun.
fun. That's really fun. Let's see. Yes, I do have to keep turning on the lights. This is completely crazy. Oh, there you just added thank you, Graham. He just added the link to your book so you can look it up there.
So Anne is saying that in the late 40s and early 50s, there were stewards, or at least she has a memory of your dad speaking of that, and she is totally correct. That in the 40s, so in the on Pan Am in particular, Pan Am at first hired exclusively men because they were flying across oceans, and so they wanted their excuse for hiring for opposite sex for only hiring men was that they wanted men who were capable of water landing, who could be sailors as well. But then World War II happened, women became scarce, women started flying, and after the 40s, what happened in the late 40s, they started realizing that women were more effective as sales tools than men were, that women could both, in an innocence way, assuage fears, because keep in mind that flying was still relatively new then, and they're really trying to convince people that it was safe, just as safe as taking your car from New York to California or New York to Ohio. You could fly on a plane. And it was certainly a lot faster than taking a boat across the Atlantic, but they still had to convince people that it was safe. And they thought that if a mere girl could do it, so could male passengers.
Oh my. There's a question from Stephanie. What did you think of the short-lived TV show Pan Am?
You know, I kind of liked it, but I also, I know the backstory of it. And it, like it's a man's version of, of, of an empowering show about a woman's job. You know, still the romantic, the love interests are front and center, and the women generally lack nuance, even if some of them are pretty interesting. So I think yeah.
I don't know that they've ever made a good movie about, stewardesses in that era, but I would certainly love to see one. I was myself taken by the ads that Pan Am must have had to run a lot of ads to get so many candidates for stewardess. And one of them said, how can you change a world you've never seen? And I thought, that's brilliant.
Isn't
It
that
is.
so
It's
good?
like, come on and see the world,
In the late 60s, it's so interesting. That one and Must Want the World, to me, the idea of beckoning, inviting these women who were excited to do interesting things and who wanted the world, like, to encourage that kind of ambition. Of course, you mentioned, we're coming full circle, you mentioned thinking about why your mom had this get out there mission. And I think the same can be said for all of these women in my book, at least, and many of the ones that I spoke to, that it was not an era in which women were invited to be ambitious or to be publicly trying to do interesting things outside of the home. And so if you had any kind of instinct that you wanted to do that, here was a job that was telling you that they wanted you to want the world. How amazing.
Yeah, exactly. Women wanted, must want the world. It's genius,
Yeah.
That might be a good place to end it, especially because the light sensitivity here is going up every like 5 minutes. It's like, take me away. Pan Am, take me away. I just want to thank you, Julia, for such a fantastic book, and everybody needs to buy it, and everybody who loves great nonfiction that reads like a novel. And maybe you'll be the one to create the TV show that's worth watching about
I
this.
hope so. That'd be fun. Thank you so much for having me, Jane. I'm so thrilled I'm really honored to be a part of Litquake. It's such an incredible program, and I'm really.
Well, let us know when your next book comes out, and we'll have you out for it.
Awesome. I can't
All
wait.
right. Thank you, everybody.